first panel here is on Libido corridor. I'll do a very quick introduction, and then I'll introduce our guests. Go ahead. Stanford University was founded about 140 years ago, largely on the fortune created by the Transcontinental Railroad. Right, Leland and Jane Stanford's fortune was came from that transformative infrastructure project. After the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, before it was completed, travel from the West Coast to the East Coast, or vice versa, from the United States took 6 months, and after it was completed, it took a week. And the cost of shipping a unit of mass across from one coast to the other decreased by a factor of 60 almost overnight. It was a transformative project. And the first building built at Stanford with that fortune was the Geologic Sciences building, right? So geologic sciences have an incredibly deep history from the very beginning of Stanford. And then, of course, it's innovated in all kinds of ways. And we think of Mineral X as sort of a synthesis of those original roots in the geologic sciences and all of the advances in computing and information technology. So let me introduce our panelists. Will Helaina and Peter join me on stage? This is incredibly fortunate to have these professionals here today. Helaina Matza spent over a decade at the U.S. State Department, which is primarily focused on strategic engagement for clean energy and the power sector, as well as climate change and infrastructure. Today, she's the acting special coordinator for the Partnership of Global Infrastructure Investment at the U.S. State Department, and she's really a key driver and intellectual force behind Libido Corridor project, which she's going to tell you all about. I also learned that she actually started her career as a rafting guide in Costa Rica, and probably is trying to work to get back there at some point. And then Peter Handley. Peter's was at the EU Commission for more than 20 years. Most recently, he was head of the Energy Intensive Industries and Raw Power Materials at DG Growth, which implements EU strategy industrial policy. Peter was actually a driving force developing the EU's Critical Materials Act and the EU's strategic partnership on critical resource materials within resource-rich countries. And I guess all of this is leading to his most recent career pivot, which is that he's a electric guitar bassist. And so maybe if today goes really well, we'll get a solo from him. We're going to do some sort of opening statements. I'll lead a little Q&A, and then we'll open it up for broad discussion. So, Helaina, I'd love to start with you. Can you explain what you've been spending all of this time and energy on? What is Libido Corridor? Why is it important? Why should we know about it?
Sure, I'm delighted to, and I'm very, very excited to be here today with you all and learn so much about this really exciting new program here at Stanford. So maybe I'll just take a quick step back and give you a sense on the why, and then we can talk a little bit more about the what Libido Corridor really is. So I had the pleasure of starting to work for President Biden on day one of this administration, which many of you based in the US, but frankly, I think this is a story that is shared around the world. If we go back 3.5 years ago, it was a very interesting time and a lot of the issues that we care about. We were in the process of coming out of the COVID crisis, had a very new administration with a different view, not only on foreign policy, but on clean energy and climate and what that would look like. Dealing with extreme supply chain disruptions, right, as we were learning what a new world would look like, and a way to really move forward with very strong climate ambition in face of all of that. You add all of those issues together, and clean energy supply chains become one of these really interesting pieces where every bit of those problems and opportunities really played out. And so in early days, we did a lot of work on not only trying to improve our policies on how we're working on supply chains around the world, we also wanted to do everything we could, both at home and overseas, to demonstrate that we want to show up in a new clean energy, decarbonized world that created jobs, that had equal opportunities. And we knew that we had to show that that could work very quickly, especially because of the experience people were having with a very different kind of foreign policy approach that they were experiencing from the US. So as we were working really hard at home to pass legislation that has been, we think, quite transformative, and we hope many people in this room have benefited from, whether that's the bipartisan infrastructure law or the Inflation Reduction Act, or really a combination of both, we injected billions, hundreds of billions of dollars into the US economy. We wanted to make sure we had a version of that policy that really demonstrated that we know this is a global economy, a global set of issues. And that's really where the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment was born, which became a G7 initiative. And in fact, I was joking with Kurt that I chose to be here with you guys today instead of with my president, who in the same moment as we're sitting here right now is announcing a whole bunch of new contributions to the Libido corridor with the Prime Minister of the UK and Prime Minister Maloney. So we have about another $300 million going straight to the corridor that is fresh off the presses right now. So all of that thought, what does that mean from a policy perspective? Well, what we wanted to do was say that we're going to show up around the world and invest in a meaningful way in infrastructure and emerging economies. And as a G7 group of countries, we made a commitment to deploy and mobilize $600 billion of investment in emerging economies to start closing that infrastructure gap and work across some really important key sectors. That includes digital infrastructure development, physical infrastructure, rail and ports, and then of course clean energy, which collectively we define not only as the very important renewable deployments, the work that we do on solar and wind and the next generation of energy technology, but thinking upstream from the mineral production that is required to fuel those industries and the processing that is needed. And how do we do that in partnership both with like-minded countries and our partners like the Europeans, but expand that fold, working with emerging economies that have these resources and have a new exciting role to play in this story. And so to do that, we wanted to launch a handful of what we were calling strategic economic corridors, places where we can use US public dollars, G7 public dollars, to help de-risk and accelerate investments across the ecosystem of investment that can really support all of these issues at the same time. And that's really where the thought of the Libido corridor was born. And what that is, and you can see a lovely, maybe kind of complicated map, is about $3 billion of investments across multiple sectors, starting really in Angola, who's been an incredibly important partner through this journey, where we've invested in a refurbishment of a brownfield rail, the Benguela line, that connects the port of Lobito to the border of the DRC, and then continues on into Kolwezi. We did that with a Western consortium, where we provided a good deal of loan assistance to get that project off the ground. And the momentum that came from that initial announcement has just accelerated things that we didn't even think, couldn't even possibly imagine on the front end. We were able since then, and these are some announcements that are also happening in real time, deploy about $2 billion for new clean energy production in Angola specifically, so solar projects, 2 new mini grid projects that are getting announced. And when we were seeing how excited and how much has captured the imagination of our partners around the world, we went to our G7 partners, to the Europeans, to the Japanese, and said, what else should we be doing? And let's go and spend more time on the continent and see what President Hichilema, what President Tshisekedi, what President Lorenzo really need and want. And in a very early meeting with President Hichilema, he laid out an incredibly ambitious set of rail network projects that are more expansive than this, but really merited taking advantage of the land-linked nature of what the role Zambia could play, not only in connecting the copper KoBold belt to the world, but as an economic development tool, as a driver of new industry across all of these sectors, as well as connectivity from west to east that the continent hasn't really experienced. And we know investing in physical infrastructure like rail and ports has so many additional co-benefits outside of the initial economies that you think will utilize those initial investments. And so we made a commitment to do something that the United States has not done in over 40 years. Said, we're going to find out a way to build 800 kilometers of greenfield rail. And that's really kind of the anchor project that's helping support all of this additional work. The Europeans quickly joined us on that adventure, and you can see that a lot of that purple dotted line that now essentially captures the southern portion of that copper KoBold belt. That project is already in feasibility. We have a private project developer, an African US company, that is not only taking advantage of some of what we call the concessional, partially de-risking public dollars that we raised, which is quite paramount. And like I said, we just raised another $300 million today, this morning, I guess this afternoon, Italy time at the G7. But what it does is allow us to interact with the companies that already are on the ground, like KoBold, but many others who are thinking about the role that they could play in the next iteration of what not only copper and cobalt exploration can look like, but what clean production can look like, what transparent supply chains can look like, what that relationship looks like with our friends in the DRC as they're continuing to expand their sector and the types of investments we can make there. So this project around rail has opened up this amazing conversation that's allowed us to de-risk investments in digital infrastructure. So we're laying fiber, we're building data centers, we're working with companies that are expanding 4 and 5G access, not just for companies to operate better, but for citizens to do more work. And maybe the last thing I'll say in the opening comments is a ancillary but very exciting thing we've learned from making these initial commitments and investments, and also demonstrating that more is coming at a pretty regular cadence, is realizing that there's other sectors that have been really deeply able to benefit from these commitments a lot faster than we thought. And namely, in this part of the world, that's been agribusiness. And we've been working with large food producers in Angola, interesting food producers in Zambia that are figuring out how to create their own consortiums, because they want to leverage this rail as well. And actually, when you think about the benefits that you take, what 45-day transport cost, time was for trucks to move across these borders and up and down the current transport networks, and say, right now we have part of that route that can move in 40 hours, and we will have another part of that route that will do so in short order. The types of industries that it enables is unbelievable. All of a sudden, the game on cold storage looks really different. Inputs coming in as we have copper and cobalt and other materials going out, all of a sudden become a lot more attractive. So this has been an incredibly exciting partnership that was really born on the ideas of our African partners, with a lot of support from industry. And I think it's one of the most tangible ways to date that we've been able to demonstrate all of the amazing co-benefits that infrastructure investment really can have, not just for the global economy, but for the people who live in these parts of the world. So we're incredibly excited. It's still super early days, but I just wanted on the front to share some of the why, and we can get into a lot more of the how and what.
Fantastic. And maybe a round of applause for the 300 million. We'll see if anyone else can top that for a daily announcement. Okay, Peter, let's switch over to you from the EU perspective. Explain the EU Critical Materials Act and how the Lobito Corridor project supports those objectives.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kurt, and thank you very much, Jeff, for the invitation to be here at this conference. First remark, I must say up front, I am not speaking on behalf of the European Commission anymore because I retired from there 5 weeks ago. But if I slip into the occasional we, it's because it's very hard to leave the mothership from one day to the next. But I'll share, first of all, my own personal credo is 4 points. I think Europe can and should move very fast to develop a secure source of supply to have a more resilient economy and to push much more towards sustainability and circularity in doing so. Second, Europe cannot do this alone. It's really important that we work closely with other partners, whether it's the Americans, Japanese, Koreans, British, or others, because if we're trying to work in sub-Saharan Africa, we need to be working together and not at cross purposes with each other. The third point is, I think, that Africa is on the cusp of a huge potential growth in the 21st century for its own economic and industrial development, and Europe would certainly like to be part of that story to help make it happen. And the fourth point is exploration is, for me, the foundation level for creating value for the future in a long-term perspective, and also for creating trust in the partners that help African countries to explore their potential. Now, you asked about the Critical Raw Materials Act. This is a piece of legislation that I had a hand in developing quite quickly. It's actually, the trigger for this was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And 1 month after that, in March 2022, the heads of state and government of the European Union came together in Versailles and said, Europe, you have to reduce your economic strategic dependencies, reduce the choke points in the supply chains, you have to develop a much more resilient economy. And that led us to come out with the proposal for a Critical Raw Materials Act to improve the security of supply for the European economy, but also to push very hard on circularity and sustainability to reduce the planetary pressures. This act entered into force 3 weeks ago, and it has the following key building blocks. The first is better understanding of the global commodity markets. So a lot about monitoring, risk assessment, scenarios, strategic stockpiling, making the companies that produce green tech, digital tech, defense and aerospace technologies much more aware of their exposure to supply chain risks, and an obligation to think about them and report to their board what actions they intend to take, which hopefully will include investing in projects inside and outside the European Union at all points in the value chain. That's one building block. The second is Europe has actually walked away from doing a lot of mining and refining in the past decades, and it's time to get back into that space. So we've put in place new obligations on all countries to explore their own resource potential for the decades to come, underground, and revisiting past mining operations in tailings and waste. To make that possible, we've also introduced provisions to speed up and make much more predictable for investors the whole permitting process. We've actually developed predictable deadlines, 15 months for an industrial facility for refining and recycling critical raw materials, 27 months for a mining project. These are integrated permitting processes, digital by default, with capacity building for public
15 months.
Yeah. For an industrial facility like a factory.
That's fantastic.
Then there's a whole thing about strategic projects, which will be mining, refining, or recycling projects inside Europe or outside. And here, we're very much hoping that the first batch of strategic projects due to be adopted before the end of this year will include at least one project from every country where we have a strategic partnership, which includes the DRC and Zambia. Then on the circularity, very much pushing the recovery, the quantification, the recovery and recycling of things that are already in the economy, with a particular focus on the permanent magnets, where there's a almost 100% European dependency on China currently, a similar situation in America. I'll pause there on the Critical Raw Materials Act and move to the external dimension. So our key concern has been over-concentrated sources of supply. This is generally in relation to China, but it can be in relation to other countries as well. And we've set a benchmark, which is we want to get to no more than 65% dependency on a single source of supply for a range of raw materials. That pushes a lot of these partnerships, it pushes a lot of projects around the world. These strategic projects, of which there are now 13, 4 of them in sub-Saharan Africa, Namibia, DRC, Zambia, and also Rwanda, they're all about, A, identifying projects where we can work together, de-risk the financing, help on the exploration, help on the infrastructure development, help on the human capacity development, and working together on circularity and sustainability. And they all have a political declaration, but more importantly, an operational roadmap. We're hoping to finalize the operational roadmaps with both the DRC and Zambia by the summer of this year. Lobito corridor, I have to take my hat off to Helaina and to Amos Hochstein for their leading role on this and for bringing the European Union on board. We're currently running a feasibility study to see different angles, such as what's the best way to proceed with the Angolan leg, the greenfield development in Zambia, the upgrade in the DRC, and how it links to a variety of other things, many of which Helaina has touched on. We see this as a huge vector for economic development, not only in relation to sub-Saharan Africa in relation to the rest of the world, but also in terms of regional economic integration inside Africa itself. And it's not just about putting tracks on the ground and putting rail stock on top of that. It's a lot of other elements as well. It's the clean energy that supports this. It's helping to understand that today these countries may be shipping ores out of the country, but we need to help them to develop into producing the higher added value materials such as PCAM or germanium, gallium, and copper wire, copper, maybe even copper film for the batteries. There's a whole bunch of things that can be done if we think in a future-proofing perspective. But we also have to think in terms of not just the rail. There's no point having a fast-moving rail if things get stuck at border crossings for 10 or 12 days. So you have to have the whole trade facilitation and sort of coherence about how Angola, DRC, and Zambia are going to work on the digitalization of their customs procedures and things like this. So it's all very complex, but incredibly worthwhile doing. And I think it offers a whole new way of the sub-Saharan African countries working together and working with the rest of the world in the interests of their own economic and welfare development. Thank you.
Excellent. If it's possible to get the map back up, I don't know if that's possible. Location, right? Why here and not there? There's many places that the U.S. and the EU could prioritize for such an infrastructure project. Why Libido? Why Angola? Why Zambia? Why DRC?
Yeah, so maybe I'll take the first crack, and then Peter, please, add on. So I should say that the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment is a global initiative, and we do have other corridors that aren't only centered. We're centered around lots of different supply chains, lots of different opportunities. We have work in the Philippines, we have work in Indonesia, Brazil, lots of other places. But there's a reason why Libido is the flagship, the first place we started, the place we're furthest along. And I think there's multiple reasons why. So the reason why I zoomed out so far in the beginning is to just give you guys a sense of not only the political climate at home as we were starting to think through these issues, but really just the geopolitics around the evolution of the economic competition we were experiencing, concerns around supply chain, diversity, and to Peter's point, over-concentration, and really finding a way for us to show up for our partners how they were asking. So I'm going to lean on that last point a little bit more. And for President Biden, that meant a new look on how we were engaging with our African partners. So very early in the administration, we held our Africa Leader Summit, and we had a very, very strong turnout in the United States in DC, where we spent a lot of time really listening to our African partners and listening to not only the issues that they're grappling with in their own economies as they're doing many things, including renegotiating debt, trying to find new ways to bring private investment, new ways to interact with the United States and other partners, but also trying to find a way to manage a path through a very complicated global economy with a very interesting and changing energy story. So as we know, energy access is so important on the continent. The world is continuing to evolve, and very rightly so, to thinking through how we decarbonize all sectors, and energy ends up being right in the center of that. That creates some challenges for our partners on the continent, but a lot of opportunities, especially as we are all increasingly learning the relationship between the resources, whether that's copper, KoBold, the nickel, manganese, you kind of name it. There's so much of the continent that is rich in that. And so this was a theme that was brought up to us over and over and over again as we were having these conversations at the leader level, the minister level, that our partners wanted to be the masters of their own resource base, that they understood how to be, how they were investing in that development in their own countries. And, what is the role the United States could play in helping move that story along? And so when we were sitting with that and we saw some of the opportunities, not only on the continent wholesale, but in the countries in particular that were demonstrating a lot of progress, a lot of development in not only those sectors, but how they were looking at evolving their own democracies, we really did zero in on this initial belt with conversations with Angola, with Zambia, with DRC, budding conversations with Tanzania, and we saw a really interesting opportunity. And that's what it was. It was an opportunity. It was leaders who were already working together to say, we want to have a stronger regional interconnectivity, namely between those first three countries, Angola, DRC, and Zambia. And we are going to invest in supporting that development of that transport network. We want to see our resources have more investment further down that value chain with a goal over time to get into battery production and further along. But there's a lot to do in that more kind of immediate beneficiation. And a lot of those country partners were doing amazing things. Some of those people in this room right now to reform their mining sectors, to reform their state-owned mining entities, to try to start tackling some of those issues around the border, which I will say personally, I have driven that purple route myself. Took us about 7 days, but we did cross the border on very different portions, and collectively together learned a lot about what can improve and how we can even eke more efficiencies out without even the physical infrastructure and just working on some of these policies. And so when we saw that opportunity and we saw the desire from our partners to work in this way, we gave it a shot, and every step of the way, everything we give, we're seeing given back to the world, to this vision, this mission by our partners. And Kurt, you're personally involved in some of the development, especially on the Zambian side. And I think what we're seeing is not only an evolution of policy and openness that is trying to actively try to attract more investment in these sectors from the governments themselves, but we're seeing companies really showing up and doing some really meaningful things. And I won't laud you too much because it'll look like we're too coordinated, but you're certainly one of those companies that are doing amazing things. And what we're seeing is that when we have these new opportunities, whether it's the evolution that will happen next further down this corridor between Zambia and Tanzania, and what the Tazara board's doing for a different portion of a rail that could ultimately connect to the Libido corridor, they are now putting forward the same standards that the Europeans and the US are offering in our feasibility around open access, on interoperability, on hiring local workforce, and requiring that from anyone who participates. That's exactly what we want to see. There's been years and years in our policy development that we've been talking about a race to the top, and Peter and I, before he retired, has been in this game together for a long, long time. And it takes a lot of work to make a policy goal and ethos a practical way that we operate together with our partners. And that's what we're seeing our African partners do. What we are offering, or what they're asking of us, now is being asked of anyone who's operating there. And that's an amazing evolution, and I think will serve everybody. So that was a little bit of the why from my perspective. But Peter, I don't know if you would like to add anything.
Yeah, I should mention that the European Union has developed what it calls the Global Gateway. The European Global Gateway is very much a vehicle for getting better coherence about how all the different bits and pieces of Europe work together. We call it the Team Europe approach because we have 27 individual countries in the European Union. It's a bit like the 50-plus states in the US. So this Global Gateway approach is designed to help very much on the infrastructure side of things, and we identified more than a dozen strategic infrastructure corridors on the basis of feasibility studies in Africa. There's also one, the middle corridor from Central Asia, from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, over the Caspian towards Europe. And this is very much where the Lobito corridor fits in, because it's about logistics, infrastructure, hard infrastructure like roads, rail, airports, but also the digital infrastructure and the energy side of things that fits into this very much. Now, why is this particular geographical region so important? Well, it's the Copperbelt, right? But it's not only the Copperbelt, it's also got huge amounts of as yet unexploited materials. It's got new massive zinc mine which has just opened at Kipushi. You've got potential for lithium in the region as well. There's a whole load of potential there, which means that it's a real no-brainer to try and work on getting stuff from the mine to the market in a much more effective and I would say in a better way in terms of climate emissions. Because putting a load of stuff on 40-ton trucks over a 1,500 kilometer distance using diesel doesn't make a great deal of sense if your value proposition is these are the minerals you need for the energy transition, right? So, we should be thinking about if you're going to have this Lobito corridor and you're going to have trains, well, that's intrinsically better than a truck. But what kind of trains are you going to have? You're going to have the trains of the 20th century. You're going to have diesel. You're going to have batteries. You're going to have hydrogen. What kind of signaling systems are you going to have? How do you make sure that this is the best possible future-proof way of developing infrastructure for the 21st century?
And can I just have one quick alibi? Because Peter reminded me of another really important element, which I touched on earlier, which is how do you do this work on massive, large infrastructure investment in a way that's commercial or near commercial and ultimately can become and enduringly be commercial transactions, which is super important, right? As so many of our partners on the continent and really around the world are thinking about their own debt profiles, which is a really big part of how you initially think about investing in infrastructure as you're moving your opportunities, further down that pipeline. Working around the copper KoBold belt gives a massive opportunity of actual commercial material being able to be monetized for more for those countries. And so much of the structure of the deal that we're exploring around this massive rail doesn't just rely on our concessional capital, because we'll only be able to do that in so many places. Peter ran through almost all our corridors. That's 5, 6, at least for us, jurisdictions. I think you maybe have double. That does not make a connective world. We have to demonstrate that this model can actually work and bring on investors. So knowing that there is material to monetize there, being able to pre-book capacity changes the terms around a project like a rail project. Having operators that are ready to come online, in addition to some of this concessional finance, all of a sudden creates a more attractive project for project developers and models that we can repeat in more places around the world. So I just wanted to add that little bit as well.
Can I just piggyback? Because I think another thing is...
Love it. Keep it going.
I think another thing that's important is thinking very much in this sense of moving towards the value addition in the country. And there's ways in which the Americans, the Europeans, Japanese, Koreans can help that happen. Just at the moment, we've managed to work together very nicely in the DRC on the Big Hill mining waste in Lubumbashi. That's over 100 years of mining there, where there's going to be a project to process the germanium, where, of course, China has put export restrictions on the Americans and the Europeans, for example. So, and down the road, there will be the development of a high-class refining facility on the spot in the DRC for refining germanium there. But a second thing I think is really important is the terms of trade. So much of the trade in DRC and Zambia, it's in the hands of the Swiss traders, right? And therefore, we're very interested. When I was in Kinshasa talking to Jacquemin a couple of months ago and at the EU Zambia Business Forum, where the president came with 8 of his government ministers, it's very interesting to see the plans that both of those countries have to get a bit more of a stake in how these commodities are going to be traded, and contracting, putting these things out to tender so you get much more price transparency, but also capturing more value for the state than you're getting today. So I think this element is also relevant to the whole idea of the concept behind the Lobito corridor.
So interesting. I've got 1 or 2 more questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. We should have a few minutes for audience questions. So get your thoughts going. quick comment to what both Helaina and Peter have been saying. I was with a KoBold delegation last week in Zambia. We met with President Helaina for several hours, and the topic of libido was front and center in that conversation. And one thing that we made very clear to him is, because it's true, is that access to market and transport costs to market obviously improves both project economics and project risks. Right? There's just less of a chance of having a stalled or a frozen product, and that emboldens us to go faster, right? And what if every time I talk to a Zambian official, that is speed is on their mind, right? And speed is on our mind too, right? They want us to go fast. Libido enables us to go faster because it improves our economics and decreases risk, right? And so there really is superb synergy in that regard. Now, just so this is not an entire love fest, let's be a little bit provocative. Kind of two related questions. Is this the West's Belt and Road? And related, if so, or related to that, how is this not Scramble for Africa 2.0? How is this not, competing great powers struggling over smaller country assets?
Yeah, so I think these are really important questions, and I wouldn't say this is BRI 2.0. I would say this is the alternative investment structure that we have promised to the global south, and that isn't just on the continent of Africa, but for all emerging economies that have been asking for us to show up in their countries in a different way. And so I think, and I'll speak more on the US, but I do think there's a lot of synergies across the G7 on how we're viewed in this space. I think a lot of the experience countries have had with the United States is that we're very good about capacity development work, health, enabling environment, policy reforms, and that we do a lot of work on the front end with our country partners, which I believe is very appreciative, but it's often designed in the hopes that that one day the magical US private sector will emerge and arrive. And if we just get it right and we build this governance structure, that we can come one day. And we've heard our partners loud and clear. They say that's great, and we want that type of investment and partnership in the evolution of how we're looking at our legal systems, and that goes well beyond mining codes, but things and just how RFPs are tendered and very basic things that bring more in investment. But we also need investment today, and that investment we need today has led us to make some good decisions, and some decisions that have also been challenging for us, as now we have to pay back some debts that, like I said earlier, are against the balance sheet of the broader country, right? So help us bring real private investment while we're on this longer term conversation with you. And really, that's where this partnership was born, of how do we have these conversations in parallel? How do we work on reforms as they pertain to specific projects, specific transactions? And how do we not only make that work government to government, but how do we capture real interest and gain trust with private sector investors and companies and make it more comfortable for them to be out there? So always, we are very thankful for those companies that are out there first, those project developers, those energy producers, those mining companies that are already spending time in those jurisdictions, and we learn a lot of lessons from them. But to bring private capital off the sideline is a long, long process. And part of the work that we've been doing is not only focused on the very specifics around these transactions and getting these projects moving, although we do think it's part of the trust that we're trying to gain, like I said, both with the private sector and our partners. But we're spending a lot more time with U.S. financial institutions. We know what's been happening around the world. You have so much private capital on the sidelines, and then in almost a perverse way, because of all the incentives the US, the Europeans, the Canadians, and others have made for clean energy at home, you're almost making it less attractive for that capital to go into other markets. And that's incumbent of us as foreign policy people to solve for. We, of course, want that investment at home, and we're delighted, and we think the United States is the home of innovation, and a lot of innovation happens on campuses like this, and we want that to always be the case. But there's enough money to go around. And so we spent a lot of time consulting with the BlackRocks, the JP Morgans, the KKRs of the world, and said, what do you need to see from us to feel more confident to be in some of these jurisdictions that you have slowly started to turn away from? And we moved a conversation that used to be around solely sovereign guarantees and very, very large political risk products, which are still needed, to a much more nuanced conversation about ways that the US and our partners could put skin in the game that demonstrates that we're going to stay with them there for the long haul. Let me tell you, there's nothing like building a rail that's demonstrating the United States is going to stay with you for a long haul. And pre-financing as much of that as you can on the front end, which is a big piece of this, and that's why we work with a private developer. They already have our debt facility. They already have our equity packages. There'll be more to come, but they are going to be the vehicle to do this work, is all how we start trying to change and evolve that narrative. So I think that this is really our way to take a long-standing economic policy and approach and try to make it real and make it tangible. And we're doing it in a very focused way. Because if I can rinse and repeat this model in more places around the world, then we know we have a new way of doing business. And so that's very much the US view on how this can work and the role and way that we can do this really in partnership. And I think if you did a bingo of how many times we said partnership on this panel, it would be quite high. But it's really true. It doesn't work in any other way. And then along the way, frankly, obviously, I work for a foreign policy, part of my government. The way that I can connect that positive economic development story with creating that race to the top in a meaningful way where hopefully over time everybody wins, right? Countries that are receiving these investments have similar type of investment coming from whoever the entity is. Those countries don't feel like they have to pick or choose one partner over another, but that they can leverage that interest among all partners to demand more. And we get what we want, which is that more diversity in FDI, a more diverse kind of global supply chain which we believe creates resilience, which is really what's most important to us. So you can't go from 0 to 100 in 2 seconds. You have to demonstrate a model can work. And I think for us, we think Libido is going to be that model.
I'll start from something that Helaina said very much at the end there. One thing we hear a lot from African countries is strategic dependency cuts 2 ways. Europe doesn't want to be 100% dependent on a single country for what it imports, but African countries don't want to be entirely in the hands of a single market for their goods. So diversification is in everyone's interests. And what we're trying to do from the European angle in sub-Saharan Africa is try to identify things not from a theoretical perspective, but around the identification of concrete projects, right? Whether it's exploration, mining, refining, recycling, infrastructure projects. It's only when you get concrete, then you can look at what the real de-risking needs are and how you can, with the political de-risking provided by a strategic partnership or a shared infrastructure project like Lobito, you can encourage industry to come in as equity investors or off-takers. You can encourage the national promotional banks, the public banks, and the export credit agencies and DFIs to come in and support a project. So I think that's what the value added is of a European approach, working in a plug-in way with the Americans and others. You can federate and get more coherence at speed around projects which are of mutual interest for the country in Africa and for the eventual market.
Brilliant. All right, we have a few minutes for questions. Just raise your hand. I think we have roving mics. Yeah, go ahead. Just speak loud if we don't have roving mics. Go ahead, sir.
I just looked up SIMA new $15 billion project, railroad point. We're interested in the development and the benefit of the people of Africa. So it's not just an exploitative relationship again by Europe or South Africa is something in the middle. Can we create a scenario where we have joint interest by all these projects? They come in and they say, let's bring the stakeholders, let's communicate with them, so we break this barrier of suspicion and distrust, and how do we actually deliver value and benefits to all? What we're doing here is one thing, the Chinese geopolitical issue in the background, in terms of the Lobito program. Simandou has Chinese partners, of course, but I think we can break through by putting things on the table and really that we need to be people's benefit. So 50 years from now, we stand up and say,
I think that's exactly right. And when I say I like to see this model be a rinse and repeat, I mean the mechanics of it. The order of things I think will change over time. So if you go just a little bit south of Simandou for another very interesting budding project connecting Guinea and Liberia, you see a lot of conversations that are going to be industry-led first between companies like Firestone and AML and HPX that are thinking about what another corridor could look like for multiple goods, multiple products. And that conversation has to start initially with consultations with both those governments about what they're trying to seek from that sector. That is a very reverse way of how these started, but everyone's looking to Libido and saying, we want some of that, and we want to think about a way that we get more than just getting these goods out of our country, but that not only some of that investment stays here, but that industry works together to give us a better deal. So while we have not committed to any secondary corridor yet, we watch those types of projects with lots of interest to see if there's a role, if there's a government-to-government role or a way for us to corral our industry, which, you know, most of the companies I just named that happen to be working in this corridor happen to be American companies. They're not always. We help European companies as well. It's been a huge evolution in how we're looking at this type of work. All the better. And I think that we're going to start seeing some of these projects start in the inverse. And I hope over time from more of a community perspective as well, right? We have another kind of piece that we have to figure out how to tap into. And that's something I think that, you know, our partners on the ground are going to demonstrate what that approach should look like. But we're evolving, and I think that we're going to see a lot of projects kind of start in that kind of from the other angle, not just the 2 or 3 governments talking to each other on the front end, but stakeholders on the ground starting that narrative.
Yeah, and in the context of the European Critical Raw Materials Act, one of the key conditions for selecting projects is that the right things are done in the right way with communities and with indigenous peoples, that there's creation of good value jobs and investment. And in the case of the Lobito corridor, for example, you're going to have to develop a greenfield link in Zambia. You need to talk to tribal chiefs, right? Because they actually will be the key people who will have a say in this. And it's like, it's not just a single tribal chief. You have to really get all that angle sorted out together. I'm going to keep the answer really short.
We do have to actually wrap it there because we have a whole exciting agenda and we want to get to the next things. But we should consider this the start of a conversation, or it's an ongoing conversation. It's certainly not a wrap. And I encourage you to reach out to Helaina and Peter at the coffee breaks and whatnot. And should I introduce? Okay, so thank you so much, Helaina and Peter.